Medical Mariner, Inc.
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you live from our Norfolk studio, home of the Atlantic Fleet, Medical Mariner, Inc.
Hello and welcome to Medical Mariner, Inc. I'm your host, Paul Stewart. This podcast is going to cover my journey in life, some things I have learned. We will talk about medicine, about PA school, about changing careers, about tattoos, and scuba diving, technical diving. Might even talk about skydiving in there, growing things, resilient living, training, anything else that comes to mind. I will attempt to get some folks on here now and then to talk about things with us, and we'll see where this journey goes. Thanks for listening, and now here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Medical Mariner, Inc. I'm going to call this episode Getting Started. This is about getting a new job when you've recently graduated from PA school. It's also going to talk a little bit about starting a new practice and what that looks like in the experiences I have had. It may not be what you see with every new practice out there. I graduated from physician assistant school in August of 2019, and a lot of other people graduated from not only physician assistant school, but nurse practitioner school at the same time. I passed my board exam, the PANCE, the Physician Assistant National Certification Exam, in September, and then started going on interviews in October. Now, initially, since I had gone to school in Florida, and my wife Nancy and I really liked the weather in Florida, and we enjoyed the people we knew down there and wanted to basically stay in Florida. Initially, that was what we were thinking of doing, and I got my initial PA license in Florida. Turns out that was a good thing that we'll talk about later, that I got that in advance. However, there's a lot of people graduating from various schools at about the same time in Florida, and it makes it a little bit challenging as a new graduate with no experience in the provider field to go ahead and get started if you're going to try to stay in Florida. So we started looking at other options as well. One of the things that made our search a little bit interesting too was the lease on the apartment that we were staying in was up in September of 2019. However, we have some good friends in Florida who we knew from Virginia, Larry and Kathy Peters and their son Brian, who lives with them. And they were gracious enough to let us stay in their home for a few months while we were figuring out what the heck we were going to do with this shiny new physician assistant degree that I had. Now, one of the interesting things about medicine and medical practices and things like that is whether you're a new grad or someone who's established, there's lots of jobs in remote areas and areas where you don't live that you are possibly very highly sought after for, or at least somewhat sought after for. And part of the process is going to visiting some of these locations, talking to them about the job and looking at the area, deciding if that's an area that you want to live in, because when they hire providers, they tend to want them to stick with it for a little while if they're doing a full-time gig. There's other options called locum tenens, which are travel jobs. You tend to need to have a little bit of experience before you start those. I am actually setting off into that field as I'm coming off of this shoulder injury. And we're going to talk at some point about how that goes and how that looks like when you're trying to get involved with that. So the first place I interviewed was for a hospitalist opportunity just down the street at Flagler Hospital in St. Augustine, about half hour, 45 minutes south of Jacksonville, Florida. For those of you who are not in the medical field, the hospitalist function has taken the place of your primary care doctor being in the hospital. It used to be, back in the day, if you had a primary care doctor and you ended up needing to go into the hospital, your primary care doctor often had privileges to go round on you in that hospital and direct some of your care. Over time, as the health system's grown and changed, a lot of primary care doctors don't have privileges at a lot of the hospitals anymore. So hospitalists are kind of your basic medical managers. They look at, anybody who has chronic problems, if there are specific medical needs a given patient has, and they try to manage that while they're in the hospital. Hopefully this is coming across well. Hospitalists, usually they're fantastic medical practitioners. They have a lot of great knowledge, and they do an outstanding job of having to learn what they can about a patient who may have a lot of complex problems and manage them while they're there. I personally think they're fairly underappreciated. They're just an indispensable part of the modern medical team in the hospital. But I interviewed for that job. I did not think I was going to be qualified enough to do that right out of PA school. I had a friend who had gone to PA school with me who did take an opportunity in that area, and it sounds like my assessment may have been correct. So we started looking around and kind of poking around, seeing what happens to go out and get other jobs in various other areas. There are a lot of resources you can use for looking for jobs out there. There's a site, if you're not familiar with it, called LinkedIn. I know it's probably a little weird me saying if you're not familiar with it, because a lot of people know that. That is like the social media site for job seekers, job posters, employers, things like that. And you can actually find a lot of good jobs in the medical community on there. Other traditional sites like Indeed and things like that are good places to seek out too. And then there's other job resources like Practice Link that help you get to specific medical focused jobs as well. I used a lot of those resources. Also, the American Academy of Physician Associates, they have listed on their website some job seeking resources, and you can get to those as well. But I used several of those and started looking and applying and putting my resume out there so it could be searched for, and try to see where we could find some hits on jobs that were available. One of the first ones that we went out and talked to was in a community called Safford, Arizona. It's actually kind of in north central Arizona. It's in a fairly remote part of the state. Nancy and I were both flown out there to interview with this practice. It was kind of a primary care and a little bit of an urgent care practice as well, in a community that's in a very rural area. So they had some fairly generous terms for what they were offering. That area of Arizona is a little bit cooler than what I had experienced when I had been to places like Phoenix and Tucson. It also had a lot more of a rural area. It was kind of interesting. Everybody seemed to have their package. Was they had their house, they had a car, they had an RV, and then they would have a Can-Am off-road vehicle to go out and play in the desert. I interviewed with that practice. It turns out that we didn't think that was quite the right community for us, just given the remote locality of it and things like that. Honestly, one of our deciding factors was it would be very difficult for Nancy to do a lot of things out there, so we decided that that was not the right one. After that, we traveled to another location in Martin, South Dakota. Now, the way we got to Martin, South Dakota was we flew into Rapid City, and then we traveled by car 2 or 3 hours across the state. When we were driving over to Martin, South Dakota, it's in a very rural area. It is actually in the middle of an Indian reservation. I believe it's the Crow tribe, if I remember specifically, and it's kind of out there a ways. We did go see the hospital. While I was talking to the hospital, interviewing with the people there, Nancy went out on tour of the town. It was a very small town. She said she drove around all the streets in 15 minutes. She looked at both of the houses that were available and on the market in the area. When we later went out for pizza that evening, we met a fellow at the pizza shop, and we told him what we were there doing, and he wanted to know if we had been to see the blue house or the green house, and he was very impressed that we actually looked at both of them. We also had an opportunity while we were out there to go up and see the Badlands. We did that during the day. It was a cool day, but not too cold. But on the way back, it got really cold. By the time we had gotten back into Martin and gone for pizza, we learned about the fact that that area of South Dakota actually has 6 seasons, and we had just made it in time for fall winter and the first ice storm of the season in late October. Apparently they have fall, winter, winter, spring, winter, spring, then summer, then fall, and those are your 6 seasons in that area. The Badlands were actually pretty cool, very impressive. Highly recommend you go out there and check them out if you ever get in South Dakota. The next day, we were driving back to Rapid City to get on our flight out. We were having to drive through the ice to get there. We actually were in a fairly remote area and saw this one young lady slide and run off the road, and her car ended up in a field. A few other cars were there. Nobody seemed to be stopping to help her, so Nancy and I did stop. She turned out to have been coming home from a shift at a hospital in that area. We were now about an hour and a half away from Martin when we found her, and she wanted us to give her a ride to her grandmother's house, which happened to be on the way we were going. So we let her hop in the back of the car, and we took her and dropped her off at grandma's. Interesting little encounter there. And then we went on our way, drove past Mount Rushmore, much less impressive than the Badlands. If you ever are out there and have to choose between the two, I recommend you choose the Badlands, but that may be just me. And that was the end of our trip to Martin, South Dakota, and we decided not to go there for the opportunity as well. Did have another one where we went up to Bangor, Maine, and I interviewed with a neurosurgical practice up there with the Northern Light Hospital. Once Nancy got up there and started talking to people about what winter was like in Bangor, Maine, we decided that was not going to be for us either. That would have been an extremely rude difference from Florida, so we really decided against that. However, not long after that, I got an email from a classmate of mine. She'd sent it out, a blast to all of us, talking about a part-time opportunity with a burn center at a clinic that they did once a week in Tallahassee, Florida. So I reached out to them. I talked to them, went and interviewed with them. It turned out that they actually had an opportunity where they were going to be starting a new burn center in Richmond, Virginia. They also had an opening at an existing burn center in Blake Hospital in Bradenton, Florida. And yes, they even had that part-time opportunity in Tallahassee, Florida. Their main location was in Augusta, Georgia, so that's where we went for the interview. We ended up staying up there for a few days. They had a benefit for their burn foundation while we were up there that we went to. Nancy was a little upset because I told her we were just going up there for the interviews, and she didn't have anything not too dressed nicely to go to the burn foundation thing, so we ended up having to buy her some clothes and all that. I did end up accepting a job with the burn center after looking at their Blake location, which I really wanted, but they were pretty focused on me being on the team that went up and started the burn center in Richmond, Virginia. So we accepted that, moved to Augusta to begin my training while I was waiting to get credentialed, which is the process where you go through getting your licenses, getting your certified with insurance companies and hospitals that you have nothing bad in your background and that you're going to be okay to bill against them. You certify with Medicare and Medicaid so that you make sure there's no restrictions on you being able to bill to them. And then you finally get cleared at some point to work in a hospital with that environment. So while I was going through that, I did remind them that I already had an active license in Florida, which turned out to be a good thing because then we got to go down to Tallahassee and work in that burn clinic that they had on Wednesdays. We would actually, me, one of the surgeons, and one of the other providers would go up to Thompson, Georgia, hop on a Learjet, fly down to Tallahassee, drive over to the hospital, see a bunch of patients in the clinic, do some burn surgeries as we needed to, and then hop back on the Learjet, fly back home, and continue training in Augusta. We were in Augusta from January to October of 2020 and then came up here to start the burn center at Chippenham Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Now, starting a new practice, like starting anything new, you should be expecting that it's going to be a little bit more work than doing normal things. However, you do want to be a little bit careful if you're a new practitioner and make sure that you have some things very clearly delineated. I was working off an offer letter at the time, not a specific contract. So there were some things that did not go quite the way I wanted them to. We were working very long hours and had quite a bit more patient load than I initially thought we were going to. We started off with 3 providers in the advanced practice provider realm and 2 surgeons. Turns out, given the patient load that we rapidly developed, we probably should have had somewhere between 5 and 7 providers. In fact, they had slated me as the lead PA there, and as I left the practice, we had grown the advanced practitioner team from 3 to 7 providers. So had that going for me. Maybe they made those decisions based on my background in IT management and stuff, but I'll never know. Other things that I learned that you want to be careful about when you're starting a new practice. Not only do you want to make sure you have hours and things like that well delineated, what happens if you end up working a tremendous amount of extra hours and extra shifts? Do you just kind of make that part of your life as I did, or do you actually get compensated for that? What happens if you're not able to take leave, holidays, things like that? You want to have those things pretty well spelled out. Other things you want to make sure of as well is that you are getting the resources you need to have enough providers to cover the patient load you have. The patient loads we had were pretty onerous starting off, so some of that was kind of expected. You want to be pretty clear and understand what you're getting into, because I felt several times that I was in over my head, and it was a pretty challenging time. I think Nancy would say that as well. One other thing, you want to understand if you have to do the scheduling for the practice, which I had to do for a while, what that entails and how to do that. If you can get some actual good training on that, because if you ever have to do clinical practice scheduling and then you have a fantastic appreciation for schedulers forever thereafter, that is an extremely difficult job, trying to work around everyone's requests, making sure that you have enough providers to fill all these shifts you need and everything taken care of so that your patients are safe, your providers are happy, and your practice runs as smoothly as possible. I worked in that practice until February of 2022, when I actually decided it was time for me to move on and get into the field I had always been interested in, which was emergency medicine. Don't get me wrong, working in burn and wound surgery was great. I learned a lot of things that I never would have been able to in emergency medicine. There were a lot of things at MPA school. They told you just learn enough about this for the test, like pyoderma gangreosum, hidradenitis suppurativa, that they said you're not going to see this rarely, if ever. Well, when you work in the burn and wound world, you see that all the time, and you get to be fairly skilled at it. You also see things you've never heard of, like calciphylaxis, which is a condition people develop after they've been on dialysis for a few decades, since that was never intended to be the length of time folks should actually be on dialysis, but that's another topic entirely. But I went on, I moved out of there. I got a job specifically out of the area, since I did not think it would be fair to my team if I stayed in the same hospital, since I'd been the team lead over there. So I joined the emergency medicine team down in Hampton, Virginia. I appreciate them for letting me get in there and cut my teeth so that I can move on and do other things. Since then, I've done emergency medicine and urgent care back at the hospital I started in here in Richmond, and in the urgent cares around. And now I am actually getting ready to, later this month, this is February of 2025 when I'm recording this, start with some urgent cares in the area, but more importantly, do some locums gigs where I'm traveling to Wisconsin and also southwestern Virginia to work in various ERs there. And that's going to be a fun challenge, and I think it'll be really interesting. I'll have more to talk about that once I get through some of that experience as well. I appreciate you taking the time to come on here, listen to me. I appreciate all the support I've gotten and people continuing to listen as this has grown and hopefully improved over time. I really would love you to leave me some comments, leave me some ratings, send me an email. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, email address is medicalmarinerinc@gmail.com. And again, thank you, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening to Medical Mariner Inc. Medical Mariner Inc. is written, produced, and hosted by me, Paul Stewart. If you wish to make suggestions for content, leave me some comments, or have anything you would like for me to know, you can email me at medicalmarinerinc@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. To support the show, please give me a 5-star rating on whatever platform you listen on, like, and subscribe to the show. Thanks, and I hope you have a good day.